Hello and welcome to another session in Colossians, and in fact, it is our last in the series. Thank you so much for being with us. Now, you may be wondering, how can it be the last in the series? Well, if you remember, in our first session, we covered a lot of the verses that were in chapter 4. And so now that we've come to chapter 4, we only really have 2 verses left in that chapter. And so those 2, which are a brilliant way to end, are what we're going to look at today. And those 2 verses deal with something that's kind of close to my heart, so to speak. So a number of years ago, as part of my ministry that I do with a team, we started a kind of a new branch of the ministry that we called Questions from Atheists. And in a sense, it was kind of an experiment. I mean, we noticed online that there were lots of discussions between Christians and atheists, and we thought, we'd like to get into that conversation and try to help bring some clarity. And so we began to create a number of apologetics videos. And a few of those videos, not all of them, but a few of them went viral. We got around 3 million views on a set of those videos. And so it was a really exciting time, but something began to happen that was kind of difficult to wrap my mind around. I was getting hundreds of comments and messages a day, so many that it was really, really difficult to keep up with what was being said. And what I saw was a lot of angry atheists or agnostics or people who had been hurt by the church, and they were arguing with a lot of what I would call pretty defensive Christians. And so the debate was not very pretty. It was kind of an ugly thing. And so that was happening right there on my own social media stream. And so it really brought some difficult emotions for me to figure out, what am I supposed to do in dealing with this phenomenon? And I began to develop a personal policy for dealing with social media. Now, this whole session is not about social media. It's really about how we deal with other people, specifically outsiders and unbelievers. But it seems to me, where we are in the world today, most of our interactions with strangers probably is happening online. And so one of the things that I think helped me to wrap my mind around this dilemma is this verse that Jesus spoke to some Pharisees. He said, "You refuse to come to me that you may have life." And that's John 5:40. And so the reason why I bring that up is because Jesus acknowledges that there are those who simply will not believe. Okay, and this is Jesus, the greatest evangelist the world has ever seen, the one who actually came to give the promise of eternal life. And there were those that listened and they just weren't convinced. They even saw him do miracles, and they weren't convinced. They refused to come to him. They refused to believe. And so if Jesus experienced that phenomenon, then so will we. There are going to be those that we come in contact with that no matter what we do, they are simply not going to believe. Now, I'm wondering if you've ever experienced a salesperson who's really, really nice as long as they think they might make the sale. But then when they realize you're not going to buy anything, they suddenly get mean, or they ignore you, or they become otherwise unfriendly. It's very tempting to do that as Christians, isn't it? When we realize that as we're trying to invest in somebody, we're trying to share our faith, it's really tempting to be like that not so nice salesman once we realize that somebody may not ever believe. Now, we don't really know. Someone could turn on a dime suddenly and believe, but there are those people out there that seem like they may never believe. And in this time for me, when I was doing Questions from Atheists, I developed this policy that I was going to be kind no matter what people said to me. I woke up quite a few mornings with comments full of profanity directed at me. I often was insulted, and people used the caps on me, which is the equivalent of shouting. This was really common for me, and I just kind of got used to it. But my policy was to listen and to ask more questions, and even if someone's insulting me, to thank them for their opinion. Now, you can imagine that's a little different than what most people see online. But it worked in some interesting ways. One of the ways that it worked was to create friendships where friendships were really unlikely. So for instance, I still to this day, even though I'm not really doing questions from atheists anymore, to this day, I still have a number of atheist friends from that time that I made online because of this policy. And these friends are actually pretty good friends. Now, we don't share all of the same views on faith and on a number of things, but they're good friends that I talk to on a fairly regular basis. In fact, here is a comment from an atheist friend whom I made friends with during that time. Notice what he says. "I see your online live streams every once in a while, but usually don't comment because I don't want to look like the weird atheist that watches Lucas's religious live streams. Seems like that stuff is going well for you, and I hope that your family and congregation are all healthy." As you can see, these are the words of a friend. Now, when I met this guy online, it would have been really easy for me to be aggressive and to debate and to argue, but I didn't. I tried to follow my own policy, which was be kind, ask questions, listen, be interested, and make friends. And so there are a number of friends I have because that was my policy. Now here's why I'm talking about all this. Because I think that's a pretty good illustration for what Paul has to say to us in this final passage that we're going to look at in Colossians. Let's take a look at Colossians 4:5. Here's what Paul says. "Act wisely toward outsiders, making the most of the time." Now, I think the first thing that we have to identify is what does it mean to be an outsider? Because he says we need to act wisely toward outsiders. We need to make the most of the time. To understand that, we need to know what an outsider is. And so since Paul is writing to believers, see previous episodes to understand that, but Paul is writing to believers, so outsiders therefore would be unbelievers. Unbelievers are the outsiders that he's talking to. So notice he's saying we need to act wisely in how we interact with outsiders or unbelievers. Now, I want to just kind of give you a little bit of a survey here for you to kind of think about how you interact with unbelievers. The first question I have for you is, do you share the gospel forcefully no matter whose feelings it hurts? Now, that is a mistake just as much as never talking about your faith is a mistake. And so we can really err on either side of the extreme. We could go so far as to never say a thing about our faith in Christ, but we can also go so far as to be too forceful and to always be talking about it. Here's another survey question for you to think about. Do you always control the conversation, directing it toward Christ? Do you know that I actually believe that there are times when it is inappropriate to try to force a conversation to be talking about Jesus? There are times when we just need to be quiet and listen and ask questions and be interested. And so there are times when it is inappropriate to control, well, I guess we could say it's always inappropriate to control the conversation. A conversation is sort of a decision process of words between two people. And so the person you're talking to has some say in where the conversation goes to. And if you control it, then that is what I call obnoxious. Notice this, we're not to be obnoxious. We're to be wise. He says in the way that we deal with unbelievers, we need to be wise. He doesn't say beat them over the head. He says be wise. And our wisdom tells us that we need to be building relationships with unbelievers if we want to influence them. Now notice the phrase that he uses right after that. He says, make the most of the time. And here's what I take that to mean, that we don't know how soon Christ is going to return. And when we look at the world that we're in right now, it really could be pretty soon. I mean, you look at what's going on in the Middle East and in our world even politically, it's very possible that Christ could come back at any moment. There's no prophetic event that we're still waiting for before the return of Christ could happen. That's why we call it imminent. And so he says, make the most of the time. You know, some have said you can't take your stuff with you to heaven, but you can take your friends. And I love that because it's a reminder that we only have so much time on this earth, whether our time is cut short by the rapture or cut short by our own death at some point, hopefully in the far future. we need to be thinking about bringing those other people into faith. So here's where we see those two extremes. He's not saying we should never talk about it, but he's also not saying we should be obnoxious about it. And that is where wisdom lives, is right in the middle. We don't stay completely silent about our faith, but we don't go to the obnoxious extreme. So we need to eagerly watch for opportunities to share our faith. That's what we should be about, is when we are conversating, when we are connecting with unbelievers, we should be watching for openings. Now that we have that kind of as the foundation, let's take a look at what Paul says next. Here's his words. Let your speech always be gracious. Important word there. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you should answer each person. Once again, it's important to notice what he didn't say. He didn't say, force faith upon the faithless. He didn't say, you need to force people into a state of grace. In fact, we can't do that. That doesn't work. And so what he's telling us is to use wisdom. And there's a couple of phrases that he uses to describe this. So notice it once again. Let your speech always be gracious. So graciousness is what we're focused on here. So notice that when we talk to unbelievers, we are to exercise grace. That might leave you with a question, what does it mean to be gracious? I mean, what does that look like? What does grace look like when we're talking to unbelievers? Like, how much can we overlook? How much can we forgive? How much can we endure when we're talking to unbelievers? Well, here's my general rule on this. Ask questions, listen, and be interested in their answers. People can sense when you're not really interested, but when you ask questions, especially follow-up questions when you're talking to someone, especially an unbeliever, and you show interest in what they're talking about, that goes a long way to build a relationship. And so what that means is there are times when you're going to need to be able to talk about fishing or football or global finance or whatever it is that they're interested in talking about. You need to be a good conversationalist. That is what graciousness looks like in your speech. So when you talk, if you're being gracious, you basically follow the rules of good conversation skills. So listening is one of the greatest gifts you can give. I can't tell you how many times that just standing and listening to someone talk about their life or their interests has left them with a good feeling. And they go away having this, what we might call a good taste in their mouth because of the conversation. And ultimately, all I did was just stand there and listen to them. It's such an important aspect of how we interact. And so we are not to avoid unbelievers. In fact, we are to listen. We are to be kind. We are to be wise in how we converse with those unbelievers. I'm sure you've heard this phrase before, but it's a good one. They won't care what you know until they know that you care. That's really valuable because that reminds us that our interest level will trigger their interest level. If you show interest in another person, they'll show interest in you, generally speaking. So, if you're talking more than 50% of the time, you're talking too much. Now, I've noticed this in most churches I've ever been at. There's always a few people that sort of prey on others and they're over talkers. Sometimes I call these machine gun talkers. And if you're one of those, I love you, I'm rooting for you, but you got to watch out because you can completely stifle relationships by talking too much. Now, the reason why I can speak about this is because I'm a notorious machine gun talker. I generally talk a little too much. And so the general rule doesn't always fit because sometimes, one person's telling a story and the other's just listening. But in the kind of the overarching scheme of your conversations, if you're talking more than half the time, then you're probably bulldozing people in conversation. Now, I want to tell you a phrase that I often use. This is often coming out of my mouth when I realize that I'm talking too much. I'll say, I'm talking too much. What do you think about all this? Or something to that effect. I'll acknowledge that I recognize that I really have not been giving you the opportunity to talk. And so I will just verbally address it. And I think, you should ask my friends, but I think that helps kind of address the issue that, hey, I know I have a bit of a problem. Sorry about that. I really am interested in what your thoughts are and what you're trying to say. Now, I do this with believers, but I do it with unbelievers too. So we have to be careful about talking too much, especially when we get excited about sharing our faith. It's easy to just back the dump truck up and unload on somebody if they show the slightest amount of excitement. So we have to be really careful about that. So, once again, what does grace look like when we're talking to unbelievers? Well, it's all of the things that we've been talking about, showing interest, but there's also another aspect that I think we have to be careful about, especially when we're dealing with unbelievers. We need to resist the urge to constantly correct. Do you have that urge to constantly tell people where they've been inaccurate or incorrect? I know that sometimes I get that urge, but I really try to suppress it, especially when it's with an unbeliever, because with an unbeliever, there's one thing that I want them to come to understand and believe, and that is to believe in the Lord Jesus for eternal life. And until they do that, there's not much else that matters nearly as much as that one thing. And so I don't want to leave someone with a distasteful experience by being too corrective. I'd rather help them have a good time in a conversation and always be watching for that opportunity to share the one most important thing up front. Recently, I was talking to one of my atheist friends, different atheist friend than the one I mentioned earlier. And he was asking why we do broadcasts about end times prophecy. And I told him why. I kind of explained it. And then he explained to me that he felt like it was just all doom and gloom. Now, technically, I disagree with that. I find it very hopeful, but I had already expressed my opinion. He knew what I thought. He understood my perspective. And so rather than feel the need to correct him, I just said, hey, I understand what you're talking about. I understand what you're saying. And, I respect that. And then we went on to talk about, I think it was Close Encounters of the Third Kind, his favorite movie and one of my favorites. And so it was a good conversation. It was a conversation between friends. Now, if I had to correct him, if I had that urge and I couldn't overcome it, then it would have stifled and probably even ended that conversation and probably hurt our friendship. But I want these unbelievers to have a good experience when we talk, and I think that is a huge asset for possibly, maybe someday, them reconsidering the faith altogether. You may have noticed that we have an overactive justice system of the people, so to speak, on social media. Have you ever noticed that? If someone says something that other people think is inaccurate or it's not quite right, then loads of people will pounce and it becomes an ugly debate. Well, I heard about a woman's approach to this whole phenomenon recently that I really liked. I was on a trip with a buddy, and he was so proud of his wife for how she interacts on social media. And so to prove it, he opened up his phone and he showed me, it looked like maybe weeks worth of comments that his wife had made on social media. And I glanced through them and I realized, well, these are all really positive. And some of them, she was commenting on things that were controversial, things that often sort of descend into a debate. And I just realized she's being extremely positive and supportive. She's giving compliments. And I was like, is that intentional? And he said, absolutely. It's her personal policy that what we need on social media is more positivity and that demeanor to spread. And so that's her policy. And part of it, I think, is because she knows that there are unbelievers watching. And it really hurts our testimony as believers if we're fighting with each other. And so it's really important to think about how much we correct others. And so that's really, really important, that we don't be too critical. Now, I have kind of a general idea for my own policy in dealing with giving what I might call criticisms or corrections. Sometimes I have to make difficult phone calls, right? I mean, that just is part of life. And sometimes I have to make these difficult phone calls and deliver news or deliver information that is totally unwanted. And what I do in those situations is a lot of times I'll actually get a piece of paper out and I'll try to write maybe 10 different positive things I can tell the person, reaffirm them, tell them how much I appreciate what they're doing, if they're in ministry or whatever. And I try to build up to the point where I've got enough sort of social collateral in the game to that point where I can finally say, okay, so there is one thing that I would like us to work on. And there comes the criticism, And so this is, to me, kind of the 10-to-1 ratio or the 10-to-1 rule, that I want to try to affirm people 10 times as much as I criticize them. And by the way, that's kind of a lot of work. And so it's way easier to just not criticize people, because then, you're not trying to always follow this ratio and this, this fraction. But to me, that is an incredibly important way to deal with other people, is to remember you need to affirm people way more than you need to criticize them. And so if there is a criticism that is important enough for you to bring up in conversation, then try following this rule. Try to have 10 times as much affirmation and support that you give them before you give a criticism. And I think it will really improve those kind of difficult conversations. So Paul says that our conversations with unbelievers should be seasoned with salt. Now, I really love that. In fact, you've probably heard of this, that sometimes we get a sweet tooth, but I like the idea that sometimes we get a salty tooth. I know that for me, that's the case. I mean, I probably, as often as I want something sweet, I want something salty. One of my favorites is salty popcorn. That's one of the things that I really love. So it raises a question: what does it mean for our conversations with unbelievers to be seasoned with salt? Well, one of the things about popcorn is that a little salty popcorn makes you want more. And I think this is the first rule of conversations seasoned with salt. Our conversations should leave a good taste in their mouth. Should be something that's actually what we could call tasty. Our conversations should figuratively or metaphorically be tasty to the other person. Now that takes some work, doesn't it? That's something we have to consciously work at, to be part of conversations that the other person likes. Now remember, we're talking about unbelievers. And so what we're ultimately saying here is that an unbeliever should find it pleasant to talk to you. Now, I'm just wondering, does that challenge you? I mean, that kind of challenges me when I think about some of my interactions with unbelievers and strangers, people that are unaffiliated with the faith. Do I leave them with a pleasant feeling? Is it fun for an unbeliever to talk to me? I think that's what Paul is saying. It should be salty. It should be pleasant. It should be tasteful. It should be tasty. And so, how do we do this? I mean, how do we craft conversations that are tasty, that are something that people enjoy and want to really come back to? Well, I think we've already answered partly, and it's this. We need to be asking questions. We need to be listening. We need to be interested in their answers. If you talk the whole time, we've already covered this, but if you talk the whole time, that's not all that much fun for the person that you're talking to. So even though you have got the living water, the saving message, and you want to tell them about your faith, it's actually pretty important that you build a good, interesting, and fun conversation about sometimes just things that they want to talk about. Now, I would say, but wait, there's more. It's more than just listening. Here's another thing that I think we have to be aware of. It's this: a little salt is great, but too much and you'll ruin the dish. Now, I know that there are some things that we need to leave unsaid, right? I mean, let's just say you're talking to somebody and they show just the slightest interest in the faith. They ask one question. In fact, I've been in this situation. They ask one question and then I get all excited and I just start unloading. I start telling all kinds of things, from the virgin birth to the return of Christ. I mean, and everything in between. And you sort of see their eyes glass over and it's too much. They feel overwhelmed. I've had that happen more than once. And so what that reminds me is that we need to do a little at a time. I mean, that's how you do salt, right? A little, see how it goes. A little more if you need a little bit more. And so we need to leave some things unsaid. Let me just illustrate this with Let's imagine that there's a girl, and she hears that this certain boy likes her. Let's say that that girl goes to that boy, and she immediately starts talking about getting married and having a dozen kids. That's too much, too soon. Now, they may both be thinking about it if it's unsaid, but once it's said, it can feel a little overwhelming. Another analogy for this would be this phrase that we use, don't ruin the movie. What do we mean by ruin the movie? We mean tell the end. And so any good storyteller or author or filmmaker understands that there is an art to the slow reveal. And when we are trying to share our faith, we don't have to unload all of it all at once. A little bit at a time is okay. And so, let's go to the rule of salt. What is the rule of salt? Well, in my mind, I'm no cook, but it's a little at a time. We throw out a little salt, we see if that's tasty, and then if it needs more, we give more, but we do a little at a time. You dump it all out and you ruin the dish. We have to be careful not to overdo it when we're talking to people about the faith. So, this is what Paul says in the middle of this verse. He says, so that you may know how you should answer each person. So this is what it all leads up to. He says we should be wise, we should be gracious, our speech should be salted with seasoning salt. And then he comes to this. All of that is for this purpose, so that you may know how you should answer each person. You know what I hear in that? Is that he's saying, I think, that we need to get to know the person. If we're talking to an unbeliever, we don't just throw out this concept and walk away. We get to know them. And there's a couple of reasons why I think that's the case. He's implying that we ask questions and listen so that we know their circumstances. Because you notice he says that we need to know about what kind of answers they need. That implies that we're going to know something about them. And how do you get to know somebody? You ask questions. You listen to their answers and you show interest. But notice what else the verse says. It says that we will give an answer. Do you know that it's not an answer unless there's a question asked? So this is implying that it's okay to wait for a question to be asked. It's okay to let the conversation go at the pace it wants to go at. And then if we show interest in that person, then at some point, hopefully they'll reciprocate by asking questions of us. And so that's a great way to be thinking about the conversations that we have with unbelievers. Here's how I like to say it. We should spark interest instead of fiery insistence. Do you insist on forcing your faith on other people, or do you spark interest? Do you give a little bit and let that person ask about what you may mean by that? So here's our bottom line, our final bottom line for this series. Here's what I believe Paul's saying. Be gracious to the faithless, and you'll get a chance to share your faith and grace with them. Well, thank you so much for being with me during this series. It's been a lot of fun for me. You can watch out for future series that we'll do through freegrace.in. Thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you next time.